world filled with cold indifference and hurried lives, there are moments when a simple act of kindness can shift the course of someone's life forever. This is the story of one such moment, a single act that brought two seemingly unconnected people together, changing everything for both of them in ways they could never have imagined. The wind howled across New York that night, slashing through the streets with a sharp, biting force that made the city seem even more vast and impersonal. Snow fell steadily, blanketing the sidewalks in a thick white layer, muffling the usual buzz of activity. At a nearly deserted bus stop, under the flickering light of a street lamp, stood a man named Henry. He hunched over slightly, his olive-colored jacket fraying at the edges, the fabric barely keeping out the chill. He clutched a manila folder tightly against his chest, its contents a silent testament to his failed attempts at getting a job. Inside, there were 5 resumes, 5 rejections that hadn't even bothered to be personalized. His breath fogged in the cold air as he exhaled slowly, letting the harsh reality of the night settle in. At 46, Henry had already experienced more loss and disappointment than many would in a lifetime. He was a widower, a father, and for the moment, homeless. The thought of his situation settled on him heavily, like the snow that piled up around his feet. His eyes flicked to a nearby pharmacy sign that blinked 8:41 p.m., the bus long overdue. The cold had soaked through his worn boots, seeping up through the soles, and he felt it creeping into his bones. As he stood there, isolated in his own thoughts, a figure appeared through the snow. A woman, perhaps in her 30s, was walking briskly towards him. She was dressed in a business skirt and blouse, but she had no coat to shield her from the cold. Her heels clicked sharply against the pavement, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the stillness. Wet strands of hair clung to her face, and her arms were wrapped tightly around herself as if trying to hold her warmth together. She stopped beneath the same awning, breath coming in short bursts, hands shaking from the chill. Henry tried not to stare at her, but he couldn't help it. She was striking, polished, elegant, but clearly suffering from the cold. She rubbed her bare hands together, attempting to warm them, but it was a futile effort. Henry looked away, telling himself it was just another night, another cold bus stop to nowhere. But then the wind howled again, more violently this time, and the woman flinched, curling inward. Something in Henry stirred. He glanced back at her, seeing the way she shivered, and without thinking he shrugged off his jacket. The cold bit into him immediately, but the discomfort was nothing compared to what she was enduring. He stepped toward her, extending the jacket in silent offering. She looked up at him, startled. "You don't have to do that," she said, her voice small, uncertain. Henry gave her a tired smile, his eyes crinkling slightly at the edges. "I've already lost enough today," he said quietly. "This coat, it's the only thing I have left to give." She hesitated, looking at the worn jacket, then at him. "But you need it more than I do," she said softly, her voice full of concern. Still, Henry gently draped it over her shoulders, watching as she pulled it closer, wrapping it around her like a shield against the night. The warmth of the coat caught her by surprise, and she inhaled deeply, the scent of soap and perhaps a hint of coffee filling her senses. Comfort. She didn't realize how badly she had needed it until that moment. "Thank you," she whispered, the words soft but sincere. Henry nodded, folding his arms to protect himself from the cold. They stood in silence for a while, the snow falling steadily around them, creating a quiet, serene cocoon that seemed to hold them both in a moment apart from the world. After a few moments, she turned toward him, her voice breaking the silence. "What's your name?" she asked. "Henry," he answered, his voice rough with the chill. "I'm Claire," she said, offering a small, uncertain smile. "Nice to meet you, Claire," Henry replied, his tone warm but tinged with the sadness. That seemed to be a constant in his life now. Claire glanced at him, her gaze lingering for a moment. "You shouldn't have given me your jacket," she said, almost as if she were scolding him, though there was no malice in her words. Henry smiled faintly. "Probably not," he said with a shrug, "but I couldn't just let you freeze." Just as the words left his mouth, the low rumble of a bus engine cut through the night, its headlights piercing the snow as it approached the stop. Claire turned toward it, her posture stiffening as she prepared to board, but then she paused. She turned back to Henry, her face uncertain. "Do you have somewhere to go?" she asked, her voice filled with genuine concern. Henry shrugged, his gaze dropping to the snow-covered ground. "Somewhere," he replied quietly, not offering any further explanation. She nodded, as if understanding, and reached into her purse, pulling out a business card. "In case you ever need anything," she said, handing it to him. He took it, slipping it into his folder without looking at it. He didn't expect to use it, People said things like that all the time, but most didn't mean it. Claire stepped onto the bus, glancing back once more, the jacket wrapped around her shoulders like armor. Henry watched her until the bus disappeared into the snow, the sound of its engine fading into the quiet night. Alone again, he stood there, not shivering from the cold, but from something else. Something small, quiet, and powerful. He looked up at the sky, then down at the empty street. Maybe tomorrow, he whispered to himself, and with that he turned and walked into the night, the snow falling gently around him, the weight of the day still hanging heavily on his shoulders. Henry trudged through the quiet back streets of New York, his worn boots crunching through the fresh layer of snow. There was no rush in his steps, no destination worth hurrying toward, just the familiar cold bite of the night and the silence that had become his constant companion. The city, once full of promise and possibility, now seemed vast and impersonal, like a maze with no way out. He didn't mind the isolation. He had grown accustomed to it, had even embraced it. He had no one waiting for him, no one left to care. If he was gone, his truck sat behind a dilapidated warehouse, a rusted '98 Chevy that had long since lost any sense of dignity or comfort. It had been his home for months, the place where he had found some semblance of peace after losing everything else. He reached the old vehicle just after 9 p.m., the cold air seeping through the cracks of the truck's worn door as he climbed inside. The inside smelled of dust, stale air, and the faint scent of something that could almost have been comfort. A nest of blankets was strewn across the front seat, a pillow shoved into the corner, and a lunchbox tucked beneath the dashboard. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get by. He shut the door, sitting in the stillness for a moment, eyes fixed on the empty street outside. From the glove compartment, he pulled out a small tin box, opening it slowly. Inside was a faded photograph of his wife Lily smiling brightly, and their son Noah around 7 with a crooked grin on his face. He stared at the photo for a moment, letting the memories wash over him. "Good night, Lily," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Good night, Noah." He leaned back in his seat, staring up at the ceiling of the truck as memories from another time flooded his mind. He had once been Henry Miles, a structural engineer who built things, a man who could create homes, schools, and hospitals from nothing but blueprints and hard work. He had a wife who taught kindergarten, who laughed often, even when life was hard. They weren't rich, but they were happy. He could still hear her laugh in his mind, that joyful sound that had always filled their home with warmth. And their son, Noah, had her laugh, joyful, unfiltered, full of life. Then cancer came. By the time they discovered it, it was already in stage 4. Lily was gone in 9 months. Henry had left his job to care for her, and after her death everything fell apart. Bills piled up, savings drained, and Henry sold their house, moving with Noah into smaller and smaller spaces until there was nothing left but the truck. He had tried to shield Noah from the worst of it. He turned the back seat of the truck into a spaceship, canned soup into an adventure, and a parking lot into their backyard. Every morning, he walked Noah to school, making sure his son had a clean shirt tucked in and his hair combed. "Why do you still cut your hair?" a shelter worker had once asked him. He had smiled, the corners of his mouth tight with unshed tears. "Because my son needs to believe things can get better," he had said, "and I need to look like I believe that too." He had worked whatever jobs he could find, moving furniture, fixing gutters, sweeping construction sites, but it wasn't enough. Last fall a social worker had stepped in, told him that Noah needed stability, that it wasn't safe for him to live in the truck. Henry hadn't argued. He knew she was right. He had signed the papers through blurry eyes, hugged his son, and promised him, "Just for now, I'll come back for you." Since then, every day had been a climb. He sent resumes, stood in long lines at job fairs, took notes at free workshops, studied codes in the library. He was building a plan, slowly, quietly, hoping one day it would lead somewhere better. But tonight, after another rejection, after another night spent alone in his truck, that plan seemed farther away than ever. He rubbed his arms, trying to warm himself against the cold that had settled in his bones. His mind wandered back to Claire, the woman at the bus stop, the woman whose life had intersected with his for a moment in time. She had looked so cold, so vulnerable, and yet so different from him. She had reminded him of Lily, or perhaps it was just that he needed to feel like he could still do something good, something that mattered. He didn't know why he had given her his coat. Maybe it was just because it was the only thing left to give. Maybe he had seen something in her that he had lost in himself, a spark of kindness, a small flicker of hope. He thought about her pulling the coat tighter around herself, about the way she had thanked him. He thought about her, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel so alone. Outside, the snow continued to fall, and Henry pulled the blanket over himself. The warmth it offered faint against the chill of the truck's interior. He leaned against the cold window, shutting his eyes. He didn't have much, but at least he still had himself, and for now, that would have to be enough. Claire stepped into the sleek modern lobby of her apartment building, and as soon as the warmth hit her, she felt a wave of relief. The doorman greeted her with his usual polite nod, but she barely acknowledged him as she walked past, the weight of the night still lingering on her mind. The quiet hum of the building's atmosphere felt like a stark contrast to the wind and snow she had just left behind. Her heels clicked softly on the polished marble floors as she made her way to the elevator. The jacket Henry had given her was still wrapped around her shoulders, and as she stood there waiting, her fingers subconsciously tightened around the fabric. It was awkward on her, too large, fraying at the edges, but warmer than anything she had worn in years. She had never intended to take it from him. She had tried to refuse it when he first offered, but there was something in his eyes, something that told her not to argue. He wasn't offering the coat out of pity. It wasn't a gesture meant to make her feel guilty. It was simply a man, tired and cold himself, offering whatever he had left to give. When the elevator door opened, she stepped inside, her mind still, swirling with thoughts of the stranger at the bus stop. The ride up to her penthouse felt endless, each floor taking her farther away from the snow, from the cold, and from the fleeting connection she had shared with Henry. The elevator doors opened to her apartment on the 28th floor, and she stepped inside. The space was immaculately clean, designed to perfection, but it felt empty. The silence was oppressive, and for a moment she stood there, as if she could feel the weight of her loneliness pressing in on her from all sides. She dropped her purse onto the entryway table and slowly peeled the jacket from her shoulders. As she was about to hang it up, her fingers brushed against something in the inner pocket. Curiosity got the better of her, and she pulled it out, unfolding the worn, creased paper. The edges were frayed, the corners crinkled with age, and the ink had smudged in places. It was a child's drawing. 2 stick figures standing hand beneath a crooked sun. One was labeled Dad, and the other Me. At the bottom, in uneven handwriting, were the words, "I love you, Daddy, Noah." Claire stood frozen, her hand trembling slightly as she held the picture in her lap. The name stuck in her mind like a thorn. Noah. The way Henry had spoken of him, the way he had carried that folder so protectively, it all made sense now. This wasn't just a man who had given her his jacket. This was a father, a man who still carried his child's love close to his heart, even though the world had taken almost everything else from him. Claire's throat tightened as she stared at the drawing, her eyes welling up with unshed tears. She hadn't cried in years, not since she was a little girl. She remembered that night so vividly, sitting on the steps of the church, cold and hungry, hoping someone would notice her. And then someone had. A man with kind eyes and a weathered face had approached her, taken off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders without a word. He hadn't asked her why she was there or tried to fix her. He had simply given her warmth in the coldest of moments. She had never seen him again, but that small act of kindness had stayed with her whole life, shaping who she had become. Claire hadn't thought about that night in years, not since she had built Infinity Group from the ground up, or since she had clawed her way out of the foster system and buried that girl who had once needed help. She had become someone who didn't ask for help, someone who took what she wanted and made it happen. But that night when Henry had given her his jacket, something inside her had cracked open. She realized for the first time in so long what it felt like to need, to be seen, to be cared for, even in a world that seemed determined to let people like her and like Henry fall through the cracks. Claire's hands trembled as she folded the drawing carefully, then wrapped the jacket around herself again, hugging it tightly to her chest. The scent of soap and something familiar, perhaps laundry detergent or just the memory of comfort, clung to it. She closed her eyes, the tears she had been holding back finally falling, and she allowed herself to feel what she had denied for so long. She wasn't broken, but something had been cracked open inside her, and for the first time in years she could feel it, raw, beautiful, and painful. She hadn't realized how much she had buried until Henry, a stranger, had reminded her of what it meant to give and to be human. She wiped her eyes quickly, as if ashamed of the vulnerability she had allowed herself to show, but she couldn't stop. Henry's simple, unassuming act of kindness had sparked something in her that she had long buried under the weight of her success. She had worked so hard to build Infinity Group, but somewhere along the way she had forgotten what it meant to be human, to reach out to others and ask for nothing in return. She looked around her apartment, Beautiful, yes, but empty. Cold, high ceilings, designer furniture, glass walls, but no warmth, no laughter, no love. She pulled the jacket tighter around herself and sank onto the couch, the picture still clutched in her hands. Noah's words echoed in her mind. "I love you, Daddy." Henry's love for his son, his quiet determination to do whatever it took to hold on to what little he had left, reminded her of that long-ago man with the kind eyes. He had given her his jacket without hesitation, without thinking of himself, and in doing so, he had reminded her of something she had long forgotten, the power of kindness. Claire sniffed and wiped her cheek with the back of her hand, her chest tight. She had come so far, but in that moment, she realized how much of herself she had left behind in the process. She stood up, the jacket still wrapped around her, and walked to her desk. The picture was still in her hand, and as she looked at it one last time, something inside her shifted. This wasn't just about Henry giving her his coat. It was about something much bigger. She needed to find him, to do something for him, to show him that his kindness hadn't gone unnoticed. And so, without thinking twice, she reached for her phone and dialed her assistant's number. The next morning, Claire sat at her sleek, minimalist desk in the corner office of Infinity Group, the city skyline stretching endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The view was breathtaking, but today her gaze was fixed on a crumpled, childlike drawing that had been folded and refolded so many times it looked as if it had lived a lifetime. The drawing was still clutched tightly in her hand, the crayon strokes of a crooked sun and two stick figures standing under it, capturing something simple yet profound, a father's love for his child, even when the world seemed to be falling apart around him. It was a stark contrast to the polished world she now inhabited. There was no warmth here, no personal touch, just the cold efficiency of a business empire that she had built with her own two hands. She hadn't slept much, her mind restless. As she replayed the events of the night before, the image of Henry standing there in the cold, offering her his only coat, still vivid in her mind. His tired eyes, his rough hands, the weight of his quiet dignity, it all haunted her in a way she hadn't expected. As she sat there, lost in thought, her assistant Rachel stepped into the room with a polite knock. "Yes, Miss Langston?" Rachel asked, her voice calm but professional. Claire hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I need you to help me find someone," she said, her tone steady but carrying an undercurrent of urgency. Rachel raised an eyebrow but nodded. Of course. Who are you looking for?" "His name is Henry," Claire replied, pausing as she tried to piece together the few details she had. "I don't have a last name, but he was at the bus stop near 56th and Madison around 8:30 last night. He gave me his jacket." Rachel looked surprised for a moment but quickly composed herself. "I'll get started on it right away." Claire nodded but then added, "And Rachel, this stays between us. No one else needs to know." Rachel nodded again, her expression unreadable, and left the room. Claire leaned back in her chair, staring out at the city below, her mind racing with thoughts of Henry. She couldn't get him out of her head, his quiet kindness, the way he had given her his jacket without a second thought, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. He had looked at her with such sincerity, as if he was offering her more than just warmth from the cold. It was something else, something deeper. Over the next few days, Rachel worked diligently, using every resource at her disposal to track down Henry. The team at Infinity Group was used to locating elusive developers, poaching high-profile executives, and tracking down clients. But this was different. This wasn't about business, this was personal. They pulled traffic camera footage from nearby intersections, tracked the bus routes that passed by at the time Henry had been at the bus stop, and cross-referenced the information with entry logs from local shelters. It was a slow, painstaking process, but after hours of digging, Rachel finally returned to Claire with a thin folder. "His name is Henry Miles," she said, her voice tinged with a hint of satisfaction. "I found some old records. He used to be a structural engineer, but there's no recent employment information. It looks like he's been living off the grid for a while." Claire flipped through the folder, scanning the documents quickly. There was a copy of an old driver's license, photo, a LinkedIn profile that hadn't been updated in years, and a scan of a construction license that had long since expired. There were no arrest records, no scandals, just absence. The last trace of Henry's professional life seemed to have evaporated along with his former career. Claire felt a pang in her chest as she looked at the faded photo of a younger Henry, a man who had once built things, who had once mattered in a world that now seemed to have forgotten him. "Where is he now?" Claire asked, her voice quiet, almost unsure of what she was asking. Rachel shifted in her seat, the folder still open in her hands. "One of our guys spotted him yesterday near the south end of the Bronx," she said. "There's an old pickup truck parked behind a warehouse. He's been seen coming and going, sleeping in it." Claire felt a surge of determination rise within her. She stood up from her desk, the chair scraping noisily against the floor. "I want to go there," she said, her voice firm, as if this was something she needed to do, something that had become far bigger than just returning a coat. Rachel hesitated. "Claire, are you sure about this? We could have someone approach him, bring him here for a meeting." "No," Claire interrupted, her tone gentle but resolute. "This isn't a meeting. This is personal." Rachel said nothing, but her eyes softened with understanding. "I'll arrange for someone to drive you," she said, her voice quiet but supportive. An hour later, Claire found herself sitting in the back seat of a black sedan as it wound its way through streets far removed from the gleaming glass towers and expensive restaurants she was used to. The driver navigated the narrow streets of the Bronx, passing shuttered storefronts, graffiti-covered walls, and people who moved quickly, heads down against the cold wind. The contrast between this part of the city and her own world could not have been starker. When they finally arrived at the warehouse, Claire could see the old Chevy from a distance. It was tucked into the shadows, the snow piled up around its tires, looking as though it hadn't been moved in days. She stepped out of the car, the cold biting into her skin as she made her way across the gravel parking lot. Her heels crunched softly against the stones, the sound of her steps sharp in the stillness. As she approached the truck, she could just make out a figure through the windshield, a man hunched over, his face obscured by the shadows. She stopped just short of the truck, unsure of what to say, how to even begin this encounter. The door creaked open and Henry stepped out, blinking in the daylight, his eyes squinting as they adjusted to the brightness. He looked at her with a mixture of confusion and recognition. His expression shifted from puzzlement to caution, and then to something like embarrassment. "Claire," he said, his voice rough with sleep and surprise. "What are you doing here?" Claire offered a small, uncertain smile. "Hi, Henry," she said softly. "I came to find you." He frowned, crossing his arms over his chest. "Why?" Claire hesitated for a moment before speaking, her words coming slowly, as if she was weighing them carefully. "Because I couldn't. Stop thinking about what you did," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I couldn't stop thinking about the kind of person who would give his only coat to a stranger." Henry let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "You didn't have to track me down for that," he said, his tone dry. "A thank-you card would have done the job." Claire's eyes softened. "It's not about thanks," she said. "It's about not letting something good disappear without being seen." There was a long moment of silence as they both stood there, the weight of the situation hanging between them. Claire took a deep breath, her gaze steady. "I just wanted to make sure you knew that you matter," she said quietly. Henry stood in the cold, the wind biting through the thin fabric of his jacket as he stared at Claire. He had never expected to see her again, let alone for her to come here, to the middle of nowhere, just to find him. He had offered her his coat the night before because it felt like the right thing to do in that moment. But now, as he stood here facing her, he wasn't sure why it had felt so important. He had expected nothing in return, had told himself that kindness wasn't supposed to have any strings attached. But now, with Claire standing in front of him, he realized that he had been wrong about that. There was something about her, something in the way she carried herself, that reminded him of the people he used to know, the ones who had mattered. She didn't have to come here. She didn't have to find him. Yet she had. It was something that he hadn't expected, a gesture that made him feel both overwhelmed and strangely exposed. He shifted on his feet, the gravel beneath his boots, crunching with each subtle movement. He looked away for a moment, unsure of what to say. "Claire, you don't have to be here," he said quietly, his voice tinged with embarrassment. "I've got nothing to give you, no job, no money, no anything." His eyes flicked to the truck behind him, the rusted, beaten-up Chevy that had become his home over the past few months. It was all he had left, and yet here she was offering something that he couldn't even begin to comprehend. "I don't know why you're here, but I'm not a charity case," he added, his words sharp but lacking malice. Claire took a small step closer, her heels crunching against the gravel, and met his gaze with unwavering certainty. "I'm not here to pity you, Henry," she said, her voice steady but soft. "I'm here because I couldn't stop thinking about what you did, about who you are. You gave me your only coat without hesitation. You gave me warmth, and in doing that, you showed me something that I haven't seen in a long time. You reminded me of what it means to be human." Henry shook his head, the words too big, too heavy for him to carry. "I'm just a guy who's Been knocked down too many times, he muttered, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. I don't know anything about being human anymore. He gestured vaguely to the truck, to the life he had been living for the past year, and his words trailed off as if they had no real meaning anymore. You're wrong, Claire said firmly, stepping closer until she was standing just a few feet away from him. You still know what it means to care, to give. You still have that in you. There was a pause, a long stretch of silence between them as Henry tried to process her words, as if they didn't quite belong in the world he had built for himself. He wanted to believe her, wanted to hold on to the idea that maybe, just maybe, there was still some piece of him that hadn't been broken, but he didn't know how. He didn't know if he could. You don't know me, he said finally, his voice quieter now, a hint of vulnerability creeping in. You don't know what it's like to lose everything, to lose your wife, to lose your home, to lose your son. Claire's expression softened as she listened, but she didn't flinch. She stood there, unwavering, letting him speak. I used to have a life, Henry continued, his voice thick with emotion. I used to be someone who mattered. I built things. I had a family, a son, but then everything fell apart. And now I'm just nothing. Just a guy who sleeps in a truck and hopes the next day doesn't break him too much. Claire stepped forward again, closing the distance between them. You're not nothing, she said softly, her voice full of quiet conviction. You are so much more than that, and I'm here because I see you. I see who you are, and I don't want you to think that the kindness you showed me means nothing. Henry opened his mouth to say something, but the words caught in his throat. He felt his chest tighten, a lump forming in his throat as he tried to keep it together, to not let the emotions that had been building up for so long finally spill over. But it was hard, so hard. He had spent so many months pretending that he didn't care, pretending that he was fine, that he could survive this life. But the truth was, he had been surviving for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to truly live. Claire stood there watching him, her eyes filled with something that looked like understanding, like she could see past the walls he had built around himself. I'm not offering you pity, Henry, she said, her voice gentle. I'm offering you a chance to see that there's more to you than what's happened to you, a chance to find yourself again. Henry shook his head slowly, the words difficult to swallow. I don't know if I can, he whispered, but Claire only nodded, her gaze unwavering. You don't have to do anything right now. Just think about it. Think about what you can still give. Think about what you can still become. For a moment Henry stood in silence, the weight of her words hanging in the air between them. He didn't know what to say, he didn't know what to do, but he felt something stirring inside him, something that had been buried for so long. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was something close to it, something that made him believe, even if only for a moment, that maybe he wasn't as lost as he had thought. I'll think about it, he said finally, his voice quiet but sincere. Claire smiled, a small warm smile that seemed to radiate kindness. That's all I ask, she said, turning to leave. I'll be here if you ever want to talk. Henry watched her walk away, his heart heavy with the weight of everything he had just said, and everything he had been too afraid to admit. And as she disappeared into the distance, he felt a strange flicker of something inside him, a flicker that felt like hope. And for the first time in a long time, Henry allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could find his way back from this. Claire's visit to Henry lingered with her long after she left the warehouse. It wasn't just the cold air of the Bronx, or the sight of him standing there, but the weight of his words. The struggle in his voice had echoed in her mind, reverberating through her carefully constructed walls. As she rode back to her office, she kept replaying his words, the raw vulnerability that he had shown, the depth of loss he carried with him like a heavy cloak. And in that moment, Claire realized how much she had forgotten in her pursuit of success. She had spent years building Infinity Group from the ground up, becoming someone who was seen by the world as successful, powerful, and capable. But what had that really brought her? A cold, sterile apartment, an empty space that was more of a reflection of her ambition than her true self. She had chased success, thinking it would fill the void, but all it had done was make her forget what it meant to feel connected to others, to truly care about something beyond profit margins and quarterly reports. Henry had reminded her of that. He reminded her of what it was like to be human, to give, to care for someone without asking for anything in return. The way he had given her his coat, without hesitation, without thinking about how much he had left to give, was something Claire had long forgotten. She had built a company based on innovation, strategy, and vision, but Henry had built his life on kindness, on resilience, on love, and yet he felt like the one who had nothing. Claire felt a knot form in her stomach as she thought about what she had seen in Henry. She had seen a man who was struggling, yes, but also a man who had so much to give, even though he didn't realize it. She saw a man who had been knocked down, who had lost everything, his family, his career, his dignity, but still held on to the one thing that mattered, his ability to love and care for others. As she returned to her office, Claire felt a strange pull inside her, something that was drawing her back to Henry. She had told him she would give him time to think about what she had said, but she knew that wasn't enough. He needed more than time. He needed a chance. The following days passed in a blur of meetings, phone calls, and conference calls, but Claire couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something. Her focus was distracted, her thoughts constantly drifting back to Henry. It was like a thread pulling her in a direction she wasn't sure she was ready to go. But there was something in her gut telling her that she couldn't leave things the way they were. She had to do something more. She had to give him a chance, just as he had given her that coat. After a week of thinking it over, Claire made a decision. She called Rachel into her office and asked her to arrange a meeting with the head of the HR department. They would need to create a new position within the company, one that wasn't about numbers or performance, but about culture, about people, about what it meant to care. "I want to bring him in," Claire said firmly, her voice unwavering. "Henry Miles. He's not just a man in need of a job. He's someone who has a lot to offer, a unique perspective on what it means to be human in a world that's forgotten how to care." Rachel looked at her, her brow furrowing slightly in confusion. "Claire, are you sure about this? He's not exactly someone we'd typically hire." Claire smiled softly, a slight hint of determination in her eyes. "That's exactly why we need him. He has something to teach us. I want him to help us shape the culture of this company. I want him to remind us of the things we've forgotten. Kindness, empathy, compassion. He doesn't need to be a polished professional. He just needs to be who he is." Rachel didn't respond immediately. She seemed to be processing the idea, and after a long pause she finally nodded. "Okay, I'll get started." Over the next few days the wheels were set in motion. The HR department worked on creating the new position, and Claire began to draft a role that would incorporate Henry's unique perspective. It wasn't a typical job title, but it would be one that allowed him to share his experiences, to teach others what it meant to care for people, not just projects. Claire knew it wouldn't be easy. There would be resistance, questions, doubt, but she also knew that this was the right thing to do. This wasn't about charity. It was about creating real change within her company. Change that started with people, not products. Change that focused on human connection, on empathy, on understanding. Finally, after days of planning, the day came. Claire asked Rachel to call Henry and invite him in for a meeting. The nervous excitement that bubbled up in Claire as she prepared for the day ahead was unlike anything she had felt in a long time. She had arranged for Henry to meet with her in a private conference room at the Infinity Group headquarters. When Henry arrived, he looked out of place in the sleek, glass-walled building. His clothes were still worn, his hands rough, but there was a certain dignity in the way he held himself, as if he had made peace with who he was, even if the world hadn't. Claire greeted him warmly, her smile genuine, as she led him into the conference room. "Thank you for coming, Henry," she said, motioning for him to take a seat. Henry looked uncertain, his eyes darting around the room as if he wasn't sure how to behave in this unfamiliar space. "I don't know why I'm here," he said quietly, his voice rough. Claire smiled again, this time with a sense of purpose. "You're here because I believe you have something to offer," she said. "Something that this company needs." Henry blinked, clearly confused. "I'm just a guy who gave you his jacket," he said with a slight laugh. Claire shook her head. "You're much more than that," she said. "How you have the ability to see people, to understand them in a way that most of us have forgotten. And that's why I'm offering you a job. A real job, with real meaning." Henry frowned, his brow furrowing. "A job? Doing what?" Claire leaned forward slightly, her eyes meeting his. "I want you to be our cultural and human values advisor," she said, the words hanging in the air between them. "I want you to help us build a company that values people as much as it values profit. I want you to help us create a culture where kindness, empathy, and understanding are at the heart of everything we do." Henry's eyes widened slightly, and he opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He stared at her for a long moment, as if trying to make sense of what she was saying. Finally he spoke. "I don't have a degree in psychology," he said. "I haven't worked in years. I don't know if I'm the right person for this." Claire smiled softly. "You don't need a degree to understand people, Henry. You don't need credentials to teach kindness. You've been living it every day." For the first time since he had walked into the room, Henry felt something stir inside him, a feeling he hadn't had in a long time. It wasn't fear or doubt. It was hope, a raw, unfamiliar hope that filled him with a strange sense of possibility. He didn't know what to say, but he knew he couldn't let this opportunity slip by. "I'll do it," he said, his voice steady. "I'll take the job." Claire's smile widened, a mixture of relief and triumph in her eyes. "Welcome to Infinity Group, Henry." The days that followed Henry's acceptance of the job offer were a whirlwind of change for both him and the company. As he settled into his new role as the cultural and human values advisor at Infinity Group, there was an undeniable shift in the atmosphere within the office. It wasn't immediate and it wasn't grand, but slowly and steadily, the employees began to feel the subtle but powerful presence of Henry's unique perspective. At first, he was met with skepticism, not just from the senior executives, but also from some of the junior staff, who couldn't understand what a man with no formal education, no polished resume, and no experience in corporate settings could offer to a thriving business. But Henry wasn't interested in fitting into the corporate mold. He didn't come in with grand strategies or plans. He didn't even come with any expectations beyond his desire to be useful, to remind people of what mattered beyond the bottom line. His approach was simple, almost too simple for many to grasp at first. He didn't conduct workshops or give speeches. Instead, he took time to sit down with employees, listening to their concerns, their frustrations, their stories. It wasn't about the numbers. It was about the people. Over time, his quiet, unassuming presence began to make a difference. People started coming to him for advice, not just about work, but about life. Henry never offered easy answers, and he never pretended to know it all. Instead, he listened. He listened when an intern confided in him about the pressure of balancing work and school, when a middle manager expressed burnout from juggling too many responsibilities, and when a developer struggled with imposter syndrome. What he did offer was a simple, powerful message. You're not broken. You're just tired. It's okay to need help. Slowly, the employees began to change. The way they interacted with one another shifted. Conversations in the break room no longer revolved around performance metrics and deadlines, but around real, meaningful connections. Laughter began to return to the office, and it wasn't the forced kind that people put on to mask the tension. It was genuine, light, and full of warmth. Productivity increased, but not because of any new initiatives or bonuses. It increased because the employees felt seen, valued, and understood. They didn't feel like just cogs in a machine anymore. They felt like people, and that was all Henry had ever wanted, to remind them that kindness, empathy, and compassion had a place in the workplace. As the weeks went by, Claire couldn't help but notice the transformation happening before her eyes. The atmosphere in the office had lightened, and her employees, once focused solely on meeting deadlines and achieving targets, had started to care more about the people around them. Claire watched from her corner office, her heart swelling with pride as she saw Henry's influence ripple through the company. But she also noticed something else, something that she had been too distracted to see before. Henry wasn't just changing the company, he was changing himself. The rough edges of his demeanor had softened, and the weight of the world he had carried on his shoulders for so long seemed to be lifting bit by bit. He wasn't just a man who had once been lost in the cold. He was someone who had found his place again, who had found a sense of purpose that he hadn't had in years. It was a quiet transformation, but it was profound. Henry had never expected to be a part of the corporate world again, and he certainly never imagined he would be making an impact in such an unexpected way. But the more he immersed himself in his new role, the more he realized that this wasn't just a job for him. It was a lifeline. It gave him something to wake up for every morning, something that wasn't just about survival, but about making a difference. And in that sense, it gave him back his dignity, something he had lost along the way. The company, too, began to reap the benefits of his approach. Word of their new focus on employee well-being spread, and soon, Infinity Group wasn't just known for its cutting-edge technology and successful business ventures. It was known for something more: its commitment to people. The press picked up on it, writing articles about how the company had made employee happiness a priority. Other businesses started to take notice, and many reached out to Claire for advice on how they could implement similar changes in their own organizations. But Claire, who had once built her empire on innovation and growth, found herself focusing less on the numbers and more on the people. She realized that success wasn't just about profits and expansion. It was about creating a space where people felt valued, where they could thrive as individuals, not just as workers. She had found something in Henry that she had long forgotten in her pursuit of success: something that was far more important than any business deal or corporate achievement. It was a sense of purpose, a reminder of why she had started Infinity Group in the first place, to make a difference in the world, not just in the market. And she knew deep down that Henry had played a pivotal role in that shift. He had reminded her of what truly mattered. Henry's role within the company continued to evolve, and it wasn't long before he became an integral part of the leadership team. He wasn't a senior executive, and he didn't hold a title with the traditional corporate power that came with it, but his influence was undeniable. He was the voice of compassion, the advocate for people, and the reminder that businesses were at their core made up of individuals. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult meeting where tensions had run high, Claire found herself stepping into Henry's small office, a cozy space filled with second-hand books, plants, and an ever-present coffee pot. She sat down across from him, her posture more relaxed than it had been in days. "Henry," she began, her voice softer than usual, "I just wanted to thank you for everything you've done for this company. For me, for all of us." Henry looked up from the stack of papers he was reviewing, his eyes crinkling slightly at the corners. "You don't have to thank me, Claire," he said, his voice steady and humble. "I'm just doing what I can." Claire smiled, shaking her head. "No, Henry, you're doing more than just what you can. You've changed everything here. You've changed me, and I don't think you even realize how much you've impacted all of us." Henry shrugged slightly, a humble gesture that felt like an acknowledgement of his own transformation, but not quite a full embrace of it. "I just gave people a chance to be heard," he said quietly. "That's all it takes sometimes." Claire's smile grew, and she leaned forward slightly. "Well, you've certainly taught me something I'll never forget," she said, her voice filled with gratitude, "and I know I'm not the only one." Outside Henry's office, the sounds of the office carried on, but the hum of the company felt different now, softer, more human. And as Henry looked out of the window, watching the sun dip below the skyline, he felt a quiet sense of peace settle over him. He had once thought that he had nothing left to give, but he had been wrong. He had so much more to offer, and as he turned back to the desk, to the work that lay ahead, he couldn't help but think that maybe this was the beginning of something even greater. It was a few months after Henry had started his new role at Infinity Group that the ripple effect of his presence truly began to be felt, not just within the company, but beyond it as well. The transformation was slow, subtle at first, like a gentle breeze stirring the air, but by the time winter came again, the impact was undeniable. The change in Henry himself was the most evident. He had started to wear a little more color, a slight change from his usual drab clothing. His face had softened, less weathered by the harshness of his past, and his posture was straighter, more confident. He walked with a purpose now, his head held a little higher, but never with arrogance. Henry was still Henry, humble, reserved, and deeply empathetic, but there was a quiet strength in him now that hadn't been there before. The team at Infinity Group had grown to respect him, not just as an advisor, but as a mentor, someone who had been through it all and still stood tall. He had earned their trust, not through business acumen or impressive credentials, but through something far more powerful, his ability to see the humanity in everyone, to speak the truth, even when it was uncomfortable, and to offer kindness in a world that often seemed to forget how to be kind. The real change, however, had taken place in the company culture. People no longer felt like they were just workers punching in and out for a paycheck. There was a sense of camaraderie, a sense of purpose that had been lacking when Claire had first started building the company. Employees started coming to work with a renewed sense of energy, not because they were motivated by incentives or promotions, but because they felt valued, heard, and seen. They began to prioritize their well-being, and the company provided resources to support mental health, work-life balance, and personal development. Meetings were no longer about performance metrics alone, but also about how the team could support each other. It became a place where employees felt safe to share their struggles and ask for help when they needed it, knowing they wouldn't be judged. As Henry's influence grew, so did his connection with Claire. Their relationship had evolved naturally, from professional to personal, without either of them fully realizing it. At first, their interactions had been strictly about work, discussions about company strategy, values, and the vision for the future. But gradually, they began to share more than just ideas. They shared stories of their pasts, their hopes for the future, their vulnerabilities. Claire had never been one to open up easily, but Henry's quiet wisdom and his ability to listen without judgment had made her feel safe, something she hadn't realized she needed. He had become a constant in her life, someone she could rely on, someone who saw her, not just as a businesswoman but as a person. They started having lunch together regularly, sharing small moments of peace amidst the chaos of their workdays. Claire found herself looking forward to those moments, those quiet times where they didn't talk about work, but about life. They'd share stories of their childhoods, their dreams, the things that made them laugh, and sometimes the things that made them cry. It wasn't long before their connection deepened, and they both began to realize that what they had wasn't just friendship. It was something more, something neither of them had expected, but something that felt like it had been there all along. Henry, who had spent so much of his life alone, had never imagined that he could find someone who understood him in the way that Claire did. And Claire, who had always kept her guard up, had never imagined that she could let someone in again, not after all the walls she had built around herself, but with Henry. Those walls seemed to crumble slowly, imperceptibly, until one day she realized she had let him in completely. One evening, after a long day at work, they found themselves standing on the rooftop of their building, watching the sunset as the city stretched out before them. It was one of those rare moments when the world seemed to stand still, the noise of the city quieting just enough for them to be present with each other. The glow of the setting sun bathed the city in a warm, golden light, and Claire turned to Henry, her eyes soft. "You've changed this place, Henry," she said, her voice quiet but full of meaning. Henry chuckled lightly, shaking his head. "No, I haven't," he said, his voice modest. "I've just reminded them of what they already knew." Claire smiled, her gaze holding his. "You've reminded me too," she said softly. Henry's breath caught in his throat, and for a moment he wasn't sure what to say, but the words came easily, from somewhere deep inside him. "I never thought I could be a part of something like this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not after everything I've been through. I didn't think I had anything left to give." Claire reached out, her hand gently touching his. "You've given more than you know," she said, her voice steady. "You've given us something that can't be measured in profits or numbers. You've given us humanity." There was a long pause, and then Henry spoke again, his voice quieter this time, almost uncertain. "I don't know if I deserve all of this," he admitted. Claire turned to him fully, her eyes locking with his. "You do," she said, her voice unwavering. "You deserve every bit of it. You deserve to be happy, to be seen, to be loved, and so much more than you realize." The words hung in the air, and for the first time in a long time Henry felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Hope. Hope for a future that didn't have to be defined by his past. Hope for a life where he wasn't just surviving but living. Hope for a future with Claire, the woman who had opened his eyes to a world beyond survival, a world where kindness and compassion were the most important things. As they stood there together, the city below them bathed in the soft light of the setting sun, they both knew that things would never be the same. Their lives, once so separate, had now intertwined in ways neither of them could have predicted. And it wasn't just about business. It was about something deeper, something more lasting, about finding connection, about seeing each other for who they truly were, flaws and all. It was about building something together, not just a company, but a life. In that moment, Henry knew that he had found something he never thought possible. A second chance. A chance not just to rebuild his life, but to build something new, something meaningful, something that wasn't defined by loss, but by love, and he was ready to take that chance to step into the future with Claire by his side. As the weeks turned into months, Henry's new life at Infinity Group began to take root in ways he hadn't expected. What had started as a small, seemingly inconsequential job turned into something transformative, not just for him, but for everyone around him. His role, initially met with skepticism by some, had grown into an integral part of the company's fabric. It was no longer just about office culture or employee engagement. Henry's presence had become a guiding force that touched every corner of the company. He wasn't just an advisor, he was a cornerstone of the company's heart. His approach to work was unlike anyone else's. He didn't focus on deadlines or performance reviews or meeting quotas. Instead, he focused on people. He focused on their stories, their struggles, their hopes, and their dreams. He listened in ways that others couldn't, and through that listening, he helped people rediscover what it meant to be human in a world that often prioritized productivity over well-being. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but the ripple effect of Henry's influence slowly began to transform the workplace into something that felt more like a community. People no longer just went through the motions of work. They came to work with a sense of purpose, with a desire to contribute not just to the bottom line, but to the overall well-being of the company. They started to care about each other, to check in on their colleagues, to ask how they were doing, not just as workers but as people. The atmosphere shifted, and the once sterile, impersonal office environment became a place where relationships were nurtured, where kindness was valued, and where people were treated with respect and compassion. Claire noticed it first. As the CEO, she was used to being in control, used to making decisions that affected the company's future. But she had never been so acutely aware of the power of human connection until Henry's influence began to take hold. She watched as her team grew more collaborative, more supportive, and more engaged with their work. There were fewer conflicts, fewer misunderstandings, and fewer people burning out from the pressure of high expectations. Henry had given them something they didn't even know they were missing, an understanding that work was more than just a means to an end. It was a way to make a difference, to be part of something greater than oneself. And it wasn't just the employees who were feeling the impact. Even Claire herself had undergone a transformation. She had always been focused on success, on climbing the corporate ladder, on proving herself. But as she spent more time with Henry, she started to question what success truly meant. She began to realize that her pursuit of power and recognition had left her feeling empty. She had achieved everything she had set out to do, built a company from the ground up, created something that was respected and admired, but at what cost? She had buried her own desires, her own needs, in the relentless pursuit of success. She had forgotten what it felt like to be seen as a person, not just a leader, and it was Henry who had reminded her of that. His quiet strength, his willingness to be vulnerable, his ability to show kindness in the face of his own struggles, it had all inspired her to look at her life differently. She began to reassess her priorities, to focus less on external validation and more on what truly mattered to her: connection, authenticity, and love. As Henry's role within the company continued to evolve, so did his relationship with Claire. What had started as a professional connection had grown into something deeper, something neither of them had expected. They had spent months getting to know each other, sharing stories of their pasts, their dreams, and their fears. They had formed a bond that was built on trust and respect, and slowly, over time, that bond began to shift into something more. There was an undeniable chemistry between them, a spark that neither of them could ignore. They had found in each other something that neither of them had realized they were looking for: a sense of understanding, a sense of belonging. It wasn't dramatic, and it wasn't fast. It was a slow burn, a gentle realization that they were more than just colleagues, more than just two people whose paths had crossed. They were becoming something more, partners in every sense of the word. One evening, after another long day at work, Claire found herself sitting in the quiet of her office, her mind racing with thoughts of Henry. She had been avoiding the truth for weeks, telling herself that it was just the proximity, just the friendship, just the work they were doing together. But the more she thought about him, the more she realized that it was something else, something she couldn't deny any longer. She cared for him. She cared for him in a way that was different from anything she had ever experienced before. It wasn't just the kindness he had shown her, or the way he had helped her see the world in a new light. It was the way he made her feel seen, the way he listened to her with such genuine empathy, the way he never judged her. She had built her empire on her ability to control her emotions, to keep her feelings hidden beneath a layer of professionalism. But with Henry, she didn't have to hide. She could be herself with all her flaws and insecurities, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel the need to prove anything to anyone. She could simply be Claire. It was then, sitting alone in her office, that Claire realized she had fallen in love with him. It wasn't a revelation that came with fireworks or dramatic realizations. It was a quiet understanding, a truth that settled gently into her heart. And with that realization came a new wave of vulnerability. She was scared to let someone in again after everything she had been through, but the fear was nothing compared to the hope she felt. Henry had changed her life in ways she could never have imagined. He had reminded her of the things that truly mattered, the things she had forgotten in her pursuit of success. And now, as she sat there, contemplating her feelings, she knew she had to take the next step. She couldn't keep pretending that this was just about business. It was about more than that. She wanted him, wanted to build a future together, not just a company. The next day, Claire asked Henry to meet her in a quiet corner of the office, away from the bustle of the usual business. When he walked in, she could see the tiredness in his eyes, the weight of the world still hanging on him. But there was something else too, something she couldn't quite place. She stood up, her heart beating faster than usual. and took a deep breath before speaking. "Henry," she began, her voice steady, "I need to tell you something." Henry looked at her with his usual quiet intensity, waiting for her to continue. "I've been thinking a lot about us," she said, her voice softer now, "about everything we've been through, everything we've built together, and I realize now that I've fallen in love with you." There was a long pause as Henry processed her words, his face unreadable. For a moment Claire thought she might have said too much, but then Henry stepped forward, his hand reaching out to take hers. "Claire," he said, his voice low and steady, "I've been thinking about you too." And with that the space between them closed, not just physically but emotionally. What started as an unlikely partnership had blossomed into something more, a love that neither of them had seen coming, but both were now ready to embrace. The months that followed marked the beginning of a new chapter, for both Henry and Claire, one that was filled with change, growth, and the kind of deep connection neither of them had anticipated. Their personal relationship grew alongside their professional one, each layer of their lives intertwining more seamlessly with every passing day. For Henry, it was like learning to live again after years of simply surviving. The quiet, difficult days he had spent in the cold, sitting alone in his truck, wondering if there was a future for him beyond the wreckage of his past, seemed so distant now. His life had been transformed not just by the opportunity at Infinity Group, but by Claire, whose unwavering belief in him had given him the strength to believe in himself again. He no longer saw himself as the man who had lost everything. He was Henry Miles, a man who had been through hardship, who had made mistakes, but who still had something valuable to offer. For Claire, Henry had become more than just the man who gave her a coat on a cold night. He had become a reminder of what truly mattered in life, the people, the connections, the kindness we show each other. In the fast-paced world of business, she had long forgotten what it meant to be human, to give and receive love without an agenda. But Henry had opened her eyes to that again. He had taught her that success wasn't just about profits, products, or power. It was about making a difference in the lives of others, about creating something meaningful, not just for oneself, but for the world. They began spending more time together, both inside and outside of work, finding joy in the small moments, quiet dinners at home, walks through the city, late-night talks about their hopes, fears, and everything in between. Their connection deepened, and with it a sense of peace that neither had felt in years. Henry had once believed that he was too far gone, that the damage done to him was irreversible, but with Claire he found healing in the most unexpected places. She didn't try to fix him, she simply accepted him for who he was. She saw past his flaws, past his struggles, and loved him for the man he had become, not the man he once was. Claire, too, had found a sense of grounding in Henry, someone who reminded her that life was more than just a race to the top. He had become her anchor, the one person who could make her feel safe, seen, and loved in a world that often felt overwhelming. They had both come from places of pain, but together they had created something beautiful. Their love was quiet, steady, and strong, built on mutual respect and the shared understanding that life was too short to spend it alone or pretending to be someone else. As the company continued to thrive under their leadership, with Henry playing an increasingly important role in shaping its culture, Claire began to feel a new sense of purpose. She wasn't just the CEO of a successful business. She was part of something bigger, a movement that was changing the way companies operated, the way people interacted with each other, and the way they viewed success. The values Henry had instilled in the company were taking root, and the impact was being felt beyond the office walls. Other businesses began reaching out, wanting to learn from Infinity Group's example, and Claire found herself invited to speak at conferences, sharing her story and the lessons she had learned from working alongside Henry. It wasn't just about profits or growth anymore. It was about building a legacy, one where kindness, empathy, and human connection were at the core. Outside of work, things were equally as fulfilling. Henry and Claire moved into a small but charming house on the edge of Brooklyn, a place where they could truly call home. It wasn't a mansion or a penthouse, but it was filled with warmth, laughter, and the promise of a future together. They spent weekends gardening, taking walks in the park, and cooking simple meals in their cozy kitchen. It was a life that Henry had once thought was impossible for someone like him, but here he was, living it. Their son Noah, now in his second year of college, had moved back in with them, and the three of them formed a new, makeshift family. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of tension, moments when the past threatened to resurface, but it was theirs, and it was real. They had made a promise to each other, to be present, to be honest, and to always choose love. That promise extended to their work as well. Henry continued to help shape the company's culture, working with employees, one-on-one, offering guidance and support, and helping them navigate the challenges of balancing personal and professional lives. He had become a mentor to many, teaching them not just how to excel at their jobs, but how to live with integrity, kindness, and empathy. Claire, too, had found herself growing in ways she hadn't expected. She had always been driven by ambition, but now her focus had shifted. She no longer saw her worth in the number of zeros on her paycheck or the size of the company she had built. Her worth was now measured in the relationships she had formed, the lives she had touched, and the legacy she would leave behind. One evening, after a particularly successful company event where employees had shared personal stories of growth and transformation, Claire and Henry found themselves sitting on the couch in their living room, exhausted but content. They had worked hard to get to this point, but they both knew it wasn't just about the work. It was about what they had created together, the love, the connection, the community. "We've come a long way," Claire said, her voice soft as she leaned her head on Henry's shoulder. Henry smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "We sure have," he said, his voice filled with quiet pride. "I didn't think it would be like this." Claire nodded, her thoughts drifting to the past. "Neither did I," she said, her voice tinged with a mixture of awe and gratitude. "But I'm glad it is." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of the moment sinking in. They had both come so far, Henry from the depths of despair to finding a purpose he never thought possible, and Claire from the cold, isolated pursuit of success to finding love, connection, and meaning in the most unexpected places. Together, they had created a life that neither of them could have imagined alone, a life that was built not on ambition or achievement, but on kindness, love, and the quiet power of human connection. It wasn't always easy, and there were still struggles to face, but for the first time in a long time they both felt at peace. As they sat there, wrapped in the warmth of their home, Claire realized that the life they had built together was the true success. It was the legacy that mattered, not the company or the accolades or the accomplishments. It was the love they had found, and the way they had learned to live with open hearts, always choosing kindness, always choosing each other.